So you think you might want a little water garden feature. What sort of things would you need to think about? And these aren't, we thought about pros and cons. It's not really all that, but just some stuff to be aware of. I guess the big one that comes to mind for me is mosquitoes. Anytime there's standing water, you're going to create mosquito breeding. But there's ways to manage that. We'll talk more about that. But that's a pretty big one. And a water feature or water plants does not mean you have to have standing water. You could just have water in the bottom half of something, gravel to the top, and while mosquitoes can breed in that wet or water in gravel, it's not as bad. Or you can just fill it with soil and make sure you never fill it to the point that the top of the soil is covered. That will stop mosquito breeding. And of course, all the little things you can do to actually prevent those larvae from maturing, like the mosquito dunks and stuff. Some other things, and I mean, tangentially, I don't even know if this is worth mentioning, but it is a possibility, and I'll throw it in here. If you do something really big and deep, like this 110-gallon thing, it's just like a bucket. If you have small toddlers, it is theoretically possible that one of them could tip into that and not be able to right themselves. It's just a thought. I don't think it's likely to happen. And this is taller than most toddlers, but it's just a thought to keep in mind if you have small grandkids or children around. Excellent reasons to do this, in my opinion. Really cool things like this, and maybe this particular is one of my favorite, corkscrew rush. But some really weird, bizarre plants that you wouldn't be able to do. And I mean, let's just face it, folks. We all know how beautiful water lilies are. So there's lots of reasons you would do this. It also is basically just slight modifications and adaptations of gardening skills you're likely to already have. We're just tweaking them a little or going a little bit different to meet these plants' needs. So it's a whole nother chapter of gardening fun you can delve into without having to rewrite the whole book or start from square one, because many of the same principles apply. We just don't have drainage and our water doesn't move away. Okay, so we're talking water gardening, and you'd like to have some interesting water plants, possibly a fish or two, depending on which route we go. What do? You don't have a pond, and you can certainly build a pond. I must say, my little pond in the backyard is one of the most enjoyable things in the whole garden. I love it. But there's lots of things I do that aren't pond and don't cost as much as an actual in-ground pond, and let's talk about some of those. First, I want to say, your imagination and the sky is the limit, because all you need is something that does not have a drain hole that will hold water. We talked, or will talk, about reactive metals and zinc and stuff. Galvanized metal not being your best choice. It's harmful to some fish and plants. Anything non-reactive, plastic, rubber, even like some interesting little kitchen and vanity waste baskets come to mind that can be bought for cheap. In a pinch, a storage tote. They're not the most attractive thing, but they work. So you don't need anything huge, and you don't have to spend an arm and a leg. Having said that, if you have an elegant formal garden and you want something really nice, get your checkbook out. You can buy anything under the sun in this day and age you want. It just depends on how much money you're willing to throw at it. I spend a lot of time in the ag community, farming and being around those farm stores and things. So let me tell you about some slightly less expensive big things you can do if you think out of the box and think more livestock than garden. So we're going to start big and go small. This is almost the equivalent of a pond. It is 100 gallons. They make several brands of this. This is a durable, recycled plastic or rubber. It's not really rubber, it's more plastic, with a drain hole at the bottom if you ever need to let all the water out, because when this is filled, we're talking about something like 800 or 1,000 pounds. That's a lot of weight. But for roughly $100-ish, some places a little less, some places a little more, but you can have a 100-gallon container that is 2 feet deep. This would support a water lily, or if you stay on top of it, even a big, beautiful water lotus in something as large as this. This is not what everybody has in mind. Many people just want a cute little something for their patio. Similar water tub. Hey, Maylene, I guess she thinks this is a great place for a nap. This is exactly the same kind of container, but about a 30 or 40 gallon model. And I hadn't thought about it, but it seems to work out to be about $1 a gallon because I think I paid $40 for this one. By the way, some of my animals are temporarily without a drink, so I could drag these in here, clean them up for your video. They're getting their water tubs back immediately after this. Maylene, you're going to get hot in there. Something more reasonable for somebody who's not quite so ambitious or has to unload their own stuff at home when they get there. There's no reason you can't do smaller. Little bitty things do limit you slightly. I mean, you're probably not doing a water lily in something this size or this size. And this is the very metal we'll tell you to avoid. But for some plants it works. This water hyacinth and this metal would die in a week. So this is a feed trough or whatever, rubber, so it even freezes in the winter and gives some without springing a leak. For the most part, they can leak. But this is an option. Something this size is an option. In a pinch, a bucket, about a 5-gallon bucket, those would work. They're just not the prettiest things you'd ever have. But be creative. If that's what you got and you can cover it up somehow or make it pretty, you can. You just need something, preferably non-reactive plastic or rubber, that will hold enough water, or wet soil even. We don't have to have standing water for a water garden. One other tip, bigger stuff might allow you to think fish, like we'll talk about, but if you go bigger, most of the options that are affordable are going to be black. In full sun, that black will cook plants and fish to a degree. The water plants tend to be, many of them, from warmer climates and will take that warm water well. We'll tell you about it being a problem for fish. So generally, if I'm going to do this in black, I'm going to try and catch some place in the garden where it's slightly shaded. You can't have too much shade if you want plants, but morning sun, afternoon shade will keep this from getting so hot. Or there's no reason you can't sink this in a bigger pot and plant around it, or simply sink it in the ground. If the light hits the black, it's going to really get hot, and you need to keep that in mind. But think about other things you could find at a local discount store, home store, things like waste baskets. Just get out and look around and see what you can find that's sizable, that doesn't cost a lot of money, or will give you the ability to do this. Here is a really simplistic example of some of the simplest approaches to tiny water gardens. This is about a 5-gallon galvanized bucket. I've got to warn you, galvanized is not the best bet, and it doesn't work well for everything. Not every plant reacts to some of the zinc and galvanization stuff, but I know that water hyacinth, for example, will just die outright because of this. So this is a couple of really cool plants. These are floating plants, or I guess they actually can take root, but mostly they float on the surface. This lovely little thing is Floating Heart, and I say lovely little thing. You turn this loose in a pond or open body of water, and that lovely little thing will eat your lunch 17 times over. It is so aggressive, so rapid. Even in this, I'll be cutting out chunks of it and throwing away handfuls later in the season. But it's starting to run. It has these beautiful little water lily-like leaves. And this fun little guy who's just getting started here, this is a new planting. This is Parrot's Feather, or Myriophyllum. It's a wonderful little plant. It's actually, well, both of these are actually winter hardy here, so you don't want to turn them loose. But great in little containers. The Floating Heart blooms most of the summer. Like water lilies and many things, the blooms are primarily open in the early part of the day. They close up about mid-afternoon if it's cool. They'll close up sometimes by noon if it's really hot. So here's one small tiny thing you could do. Here's a slightly bigger version. We're not going to do a lot of emphasis on water gardens because we weren't talking ponds and things, and you really need a pretty sizable tub to support a water lily. But this is one of my favorite water lilies. There's large ones, small ones, dwarf ones, and for containers you want some of the smaller ones, which this is not. This is a variety called Texas Dawn. It's one of the best yellows you can get. I love the speckled mottled leaves when they first emerge. They do turn green, and if I can get this in the shot, it's one of the few hardy lilies that actually stick a stem out of the water. So when this plant's happy, you get flowers that literally stick way up and are much more visible. So we're going to talk about potting lilies and stuff when we cover that. But these are just a couple of examples I have on site of very small water gardens. Okay, here's an example, similar size tub, and to be honest with you, these tubs I have are perfect, but they're recycled cattle protein tubs that I use on the farm, and you can't easily just buy one unless you pay the full amount for the protein supplement that's in it, and you probably don't want that. But they hold roughly 20 to 25 gallons. We've talked about how farm supplies have similar things you can purchase for not a lot of money. Also want to point out the water hyacinth. The things you see floating are fish food. I was hoping, I've got a few goldfish in here. I was hoping we could get them to come up. But of course, when I'm standing here talking, they're not going to. This is water hyacinth. It is a non-hardy, meaning doesn't survive the winter. Really cool floating plant. It has little fat bubbles that keep it afloat in the water. If I lift it out, it's got roots that hang in. And this is a little too much shade, which benefits the fish, but our water hyacinth may not flower here. And more sunlight, the water hyacinth would produce beautiful, big, fat, purple spikes of flowers that look sort of like lavender hyacinths. It's a really showy thing. And they send off side runners like strawberries do and make new plants. So in a few weeks, this will cover the whole surface of the pond, and I'll have to start breaking them off, giving them to friends, throwing them out, things like that, just so I can still have a little view of my fish. Usually when I throw water in here, the 2 or 3 little goldfish I have will come up and eat. Let's talk about fish for a second. First of all, this is sunk in a galvanized tub surrounded by plants, and that's for a reason. That black tub would get so hot, the goldfish wouldn't stand a chance. Goldfish are generally denizens of cooler waters, not hot water. They're pretty tough and they're pretty tolerant, but this in full sun would not be the best situation for goldfish. So here it gets a little bit of morning sun, not afternoon sun. You can find all sorts of tutorials online about acclimating goldfish. The same thing you would do in an aquarium you'd do here. You'd float the bag, adjust the temperatures. Of course, tap water doesn't work. You can never add that. You have to dechlorinate and make the water safe to add to this fish pond. But it's a lot of fun, and it can add another living element. They do sometimes marginally help with mosquito control, which is a problem. In fact, let me just talk before we get heavily into fish about mosquito control. I don't know if we saw that one or not. One came up and took a plug out of a fish food. Back to the mosquito control, it's going to be a problem. We have water. There is an option we can talk about, and we talked about earlier, where there's mostly wet soil, and that works for some plants, not others. That doesn't allow mosquitoes as long as you never let there be a puddle on top. Generally, water gardens are going to breed mosquitoes. There are these wonderful little biologically safe pesticides that contain the pesticide Bacillus thuringiensis. For mosquito, the specific strain is Israeliensis, and that is a really good and effective thing. You buy these things, they're about $2 each. They come in a strip of, I think, 8. And you can find them at any garden center or pond supply store or online. All of this water stuff is so available on Amazon, dropped at your door. They even guarantee fish in some instances, I understand. Also, if you can find a chain store that still has a tiny little set of fish tanks in it, which is going away rapidly, you can often buy very inexpensive feeder goldfish. Sometimes bait stores will sell some goldfish, but they tend to be plain. But the goldfish are a nice addition. You've got to have some serious body of water. They may not survive the winter outdoors, but they can add another really cool element. But anytime we have standing water, we've got to be very concerned about mosquito control. Here's another example of an approach to a water garden. This doesn't even look like a water garden, but it's basically bog plants that need moisture and poor drainage. But growing something like this is not going to support mosquitoes as long as you don't fill the tub up to the point they're standing water. Ignore the glass fruit. I just like bright colors. But this is nothing more than horsetail rush, which is an extremely invasive native plant you would never want to unleash. And this keeps the roots intact, but I'm not sure some of these little pod structures, that actually produces spores. I now need to get worried about whether those will start other plants like ferns do. And one of my favorite things, this is a hardy pitcher plant, like grow in the wet, boggy areas in the Carolinas and things, some of those lowland areas. But that'll get much bigger, and these are the carnivorous plants that capture insects. So this is just a fun little thing that is actually a type of water garden or wet soil, no drainage, but another thing you could do that's kind of fun with unique plants. Here we are for an up close and personal look at all the different types of water plants, or the classifications, and these aren't really classifications, they're just different aquatic plants grow in somewhat different manners. So I'm going to start with the deepest underwater stuff and work my way toward the surface as best I can. Let me see if I can find it. Somewhere in here, I hope I'm not in the wrong bucket, and I am. Over here, we have an example of a completely submerged plant. This is coontail or Ceratophyllum. In the water, these actually fan out, and it's prettier underwater than out. But this sometimes floats near the surface, but it's always completely in water. It will sometimes root in mud if it's there, but it's always going to be below the surface. These are great because they serve as oxygenators. If you were doing an actual fish pond where you were worried about fish health, these underwater things tend to do a lot to keep the water cleaner and keep oxygen in that water column. So those are very, very useful. They can also help with algae because they use some of the nutrients in the water. The free nutrients would grow algae. Just beyond those completely submerged plants, we would have things like this, the parrot's feather, and lots of other things that may root in the bottom, do not have to. But this is a floating thing, often sold as a bundle of stems, or if you have friends with water gardens, they'll often just pinch off and share. This stuff is also vigorous. Anybody who's got it will have plenty. And I should mention about sourcing things. When we started delving into this class and looking for some plants, part of the reason I'm spending so much time in the leach field mess that is my farm pond is we learned that many of the local little hobbyist type garden center type places that have water plants are largely going by the wayside. And I think that's because all of this is now available online through an Amazon, delivered to your door for not much more money. So that is kind of cut into that. So you may not be able to just go buy a potted lily as easily as we could have 20 years ago. So from the emergent plants, which tend to have some things underwater and some things out, may or may not be rooted, this is kind of riding the fence between, but this again is the water or floating heart, and it can either just float, or if there are parts that come near the soil, it'll take a little bit of root, but it runs and runs and runs on the water surface. All of these, again, I've beaten this horse to death, but they will get away from you. Don't put them in earth bottom ponds unless you never want to see water surface again. This is a completely floating plant. This one's tropical. I really wouldn't hesitate much to put this in a pond. It may cover it in a single season, but with a hard freeze, it's dead and gone and not coming back. Now that does create a sludgy mess in the pond. That's going to take a while to rot and decompose, and then that would cause nutrient issues. So maybe or maybe not go that route. But winter kills it, which keeps it from becoming horrifically invasive this far north. Over here, we're coming further up in the water, getting into more mud and stuff, and we have these marginal plants, or bog plants, they're often called. These little divisions would be similar to what you might receive. They might be bare root, with or without soil. These are some sedges that want to be in very shallow water. Actually would be happiest with just maybe some mud or an inch or two of water. So all of how these plants grow and where they grow will affect how deep you sink that pot or how deeply you plant them in your little tub garden. So a couple of interesting sedges, blue arrow, and I forget this one off the top of my head. Google will help you figure it out. Another marginal or bog plant, this is variegated sweet flag. It's one of my favorites. It's very beautiful, striking variegation. Just like when planting a flower pot or a landscape planting, you want to think about textures and heights and contrast. You know, this is going to give you a strong vertical. It's going to contrast nicely with some of these things that are lower. And you can even have some things like the parrot's feather and stuff that'll even spill over the edge as they grow. And finally, This is probably not logical for a little tiny garden the size of these tubs we're looking at here. But the queen of all of it, of course, well, the queen might be the lotus, and that's too huge. We're not even getting into that today. But water lilies. Water lilies are just kind of the first water plant people think of, and rightly so. They have beautiful blooms. You have seen some of those today on that Texas Dawn, or will. And this is just a lovely piece of Texas Dawn. This is about what you would get through the mail. I'll be honest with you, some of the mail order companies are a little stingy, so you might not have quite all of this, but they grow so rapidly it won't matter. So these are sort of, oh, there's one more I left out. I told you when I was up to my neck sinking quick in that nasty pond about the duckweed and milfoil. Ignore this little white stuff. That's some perlite that's coming over some of these, off of these plants in soil. This stuff, I've got to warn you, if you get plants in the mail, almost any water plant you encounter is likely to have some tiny bits of this stuck to it. It's almost inevitable. No matter how much you wash, you can't get them perfectly clean. The little tiny stuff is water meal. These two-leaf things that look a little bigger are duckweed. They're noxious weeds in many of our farm ponds and things because they just choke the surface, block out all of the light. Having said that, in a contained tub garden, if you're not doing fish or anything you want to see in the water, they add a really pretty chartreusey green layer, and there's no reason you couldn't let them do that. I guarantee you some of the plants you use in your thing will come with some of this, whether you like it or not. One of the best methods I've found to clean this up, and it doesn't happen in one time, you have to repeat this again and again throughout the season, but if you don't have fish, and chlorinated water is not an issue, or you could collect rainwater, but just adding water to this, filling it up to the brim, and letting it run over for a period of time, these tiny things will just wash out of the surface. I'll try and show you over here. But as that water overflows, it takes that stuff with it. And if you do that a few times, you can eliminate most of this. You can also just skim it off the surface, get the bulk of it out of there, throw it away. A net would be handy for that. But there's a lot of ways to manage it, and you may not even need to manage it. So there's a look at all the different kind of places water plants grow, how they would grow differently, and we share this in such depth because it's going to affect how you pot and where they go in your tub once we get into potting. I talk too much and lose sight of what I'm saying. Carrie raised a legitimate point. I said this water hyacinth was tropical, and there's others, there's water lettuce and similar things that just won't survive our winters outdoors. And I'm not promising in a tub like this that freezes solid any of this is surviving outdoors. If you had 2 feet of water, it would all come through beautifully. There's a very good chance if you've got a fair amount of soil in your tub, the marginal plants will just laugh it off and come through winter no matter what. But something like this that's tropical, what do? I got to be honest with you. Without a greenhouse, you're probably not doing much, but here's something might be worth trying. I attempted it once years ago, didn't put much effort into it. I failed, but I probably also wasn't highest priority in my life at the time. I would suggest if you want to try and bring one of these in and overwinter it, you get a nice healthy young one from one of the growing tips, and you drop it in a little glass container of water. A jar would be great. Brightest light you can give it. I feel like a half full jar, like a mason jar, with a small one of these would give you a little bit of increased humidity, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be all about the sunlight. Don't worry if the jar gets green with algae, the water part, because that actually means there's nutrients and this plant's going to benefit from that slightly. So it's worth trying, no promises. If you need to buy another one, literally they're about $7 a piece or 3 for $20 or something. Well, it's just like geraniums. Your geranium don't make it. Are you going to kick yourself and beat yourself up? No, you're going to go drop $20 and get another box up. So some of that applies here. I think as beginner gardeners especially, people are afraid to fail. They're so terrified of failing or doing something wrong. It happens. The most experienced of us who have done this for a lifetime, oh my God, we fail so much. We just don't focus on it because we know you just keep plugging on and keep trying and it'll eventually work, and that's how you learn. Now for some of the nuts and bolts of how to do all these things. We're going to talk primarily about potting, or what you grow the stuff in. We've talked about some tub options and things. That's more the outside shell. This is not what we're talking about here, because we're talking about smaller pots or things that will actually hold the plants in some bigger vessel, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. If this is our vessel or our garden or pond per se, there's no reason we couldn't have a 3 or 4 inch layer of actual soil, or even fill this with actual soil, depending on which of those plant categories you need to grow. Most of us think water garden, feature water plants, we think about some actual free water, floating water, that stuff, and maybe a fish or two. I'll be honest with you, fish aren't essential, but they do feed the plants. And for me personally, I want the fish. I want a little fish. They're so cool. Even if it's a tiny one in something like this, I want a fish. Maybe 3. I'm greedy. Okay, how to pot. You could just add soil to the bottom, and I'm going to tell you some soil options as well. But for me, I have acreage. I have all this god-awful clay like you guys do, and that's the best thing for water plants. You don't want your rich organic garden soil for this. You want heavy, mucky clay. That's what's best, and it's also what's going to come out. The holes in the bottom of the pot aren't essential, but they're really helpful because roots will go through them, and that will be part of your filtration or what clears the water. So holes at the bottom are good. If your holes are really big in the container you choose, you may want to add fabric or burlap just to keep it from leaking out. We want clay mud, but we don't want it leaking out to the point that it turns our whole water to clay mud. And usually that's going to be accomplished through gravel. So this is still fairly dry. I just dug it up, but it's very, very clay, and it's going to end up a nasty mess. But let's talk about what you put them in. This is what is commonly known in the industry as a mum pan. You see that this pot is broader than it is tall. And the reason I emphasize that, this is a form of hanging basket, and these are recycled. I've intentionally gone out of my way to get black and dark colors in a small amount of water will disappear. Yes, you may hear some duck noise in the background. I've got some muscovies back here trying to do their thing. So anyway, the pot, I prefer something low and broad so that things don't blow over. Some things, like these sweet flag, are so tall, a windy day, even this may get blown over. So you want to keep that in mind. And if you put your soil directly in the bottom of the whole thing, you don't have to worry about that so much. The other thing to think about, we'll talk fertilization and stuff in a minute, but suppose you don't have all the acreage in the world in an obvious place, or you don't want to dig up your yard to get the yucky clay soil, or if you're fortunate enough to have all your beds and yards be great soil, what do? I'm going to show you some tips because I have some options around here, like pea gravel and stuff. There's a cheat for people who don't have soil. I don't like it as much, but I'll tell you about it in just a minute. So just straight to the potting. We want the pot to have soil in it. I'm going to wet that so it'll smush down a little more. We want the pot to have soil in it, but we don't want it completely full of soil. In fact, I wish I didn't have as much in this one, because soil to the surface or near the top equates to muddy water. So God, this clay is gross, but this is what we're talking about. And then for most of these plants, we're going to, like, you have heard about the different types of plants and what depth in the water they would occur. So you have options. You can use smaller pots which tip more readily, but you can put one plant in each pot, and then if you have other ponds or something big, you can rearrange them and move them around. I'm, for simplicity's sake, probably going to choose a bigger pot. This is about the right size for one water lily, which I mentioned you don't have to have a water lily. They're kind of fun, but you probably need a bigger tub for the actual outside vessel. But I'm going to use one of these bigger ones, and I'm going to pot several of our plants in this, as opposed to 3 smaller pots with 3 plants or something like that. So you have to keep in mind, this is all going to be the same depth. So we're going to work, this is almost as deep as our container. I'm just going to pot them kind of the same depth they were growing before. And I'll tell you what, I don't have pruners out here, but forgive my crude attempt at cutting this back. It's easier just to do this when you plant. It'll give it an opportunity to take root firmly without blowing over. And generally when you receive plants, whether it be through the mail or whatever, they'll already be cut back just for shipping purposes. So that's probably going to be done for you. The other cool thing about water plants or aquatic plants, even marginals, they're forgiving. If these were actual vegetables or annuals, we'd be all hung up about getting the depth right. You get these a little too deep or a little too shallow, it don't matter. They'll just carry on and they'll sort it all out because they grow so rapidly. So that's a little sweet flag, but that looks kind of stingy in my opinion. So since I'm doing something a little larger scale, and some of them have more roots than others, but I think because I'm all about the no patience, instant gratification, I'm going to do something more like this just to get it looking full and nice faster. You don't need to. These things grow like so fast. It'll blow your mind how quickly water plants grow. Let's see. Just for fun, I've got this weird little wonderful corkscrew rush. Not the easiest thing to find. You don't have to have one, but I've got one here, and you better believe I'm going to use him because he's so dang cute. And I'm going to put this in here. You can see we've already got some interesting contrast because these plants are so very, very different in appearance. And boy, this is mucky, which is what you want. If you ever stuck your toes in the bottom of a pond, and trust me, you saw in the front of this, I got plenty of experience. That's just gummy clay. I really have too much in here because here's where you're going to use some gravel no matter what. But if you're in a pinch and do not have all this clay soil, or quite frankly, you're one of those people that don't want to get this dirty, you can just use, I would never recommend solid gravel. It can be done, but I always want, the clay soil holds on to nutrients a little better, but being in solid gravel would lead to more filtration and more roots pulling nutrients out of the water. I like a balance, a mix of the two. So what I'm going to show you here, this is the smallest pea gravel I could find, and I am very nuts and perfectionist about this stuff. I don't want a white gravel. I don't want marble chips. I want it to be hard to see. I don't want it to be the most glaring, obvious thing when you look in my water garden that there's some big bright gravel. Sure, if it's your cup of tea, get the fluorescent pink aquarium gravel for this step. That's up to you. I ain't doing it. Okay, we got a couple of things here. This is an opportunity too to take a few of your little emergent plants that may or may not have to be rooted, but I'm going to get them in here because the nutrients in the soil will help them grow a little faster. And again, as I mentioned, we're almost at soil level here, so that's another reason I want my gravel to be kind of blend in as opposed to sticking out like if it were white or pink or blue. I have seen some cool things done with white, pinks, and blues and loud colors. Don't get me wrong, and I'm all about the color, but right now my mind's in a more natural place and a more unobtrusive place with this gravel. So we've done lots of things there. I have some space. I'm going to add some maybe parrot's feather. That would, I think, because these are beautiful. I've got a little round texture floaty thing. I've got some tall grassy things. I've got some really interesting stuff. And now I want something in a tiny spot that's going to make this appear, well, just contrast. Whether I am doing flowers, landscape design, whatever, it's about contrast. If everything looks like a grass, this is boring. If you have weirdly divergent, strange textures and things next to each other, like in this case, these round leaves, this has been bug bitten, but round leaves versus this fluffy fuzzy texture, that really works a little better. It makes the eye, it's a little more pleasing to the eye, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And you know this, if you've got geraniums, or even if you get a bud vase with a rose in it, there's probably some baby's breath or something of a different texture in there just to make it interesting. So that's where I'm at. Part of the reason, now I have used so little gravel, this is going to be mud central. I've already made this water so muddy it doesn't matter. And if you were doing these individually, exact same thing, it's just we're using a small pot for each plant instead of one big pot. This is kind of one of the easiest shortcut ways, And honestly, the easiest shortcut would be to just use your bigger vessel and add soil and gravel to the bottom. But hopefully, and this is going to be a disaster because I've got so much mud near the top, it's going to just be mud immersion. But if we'd done this better or used a much thicker layer of gravel, we wouldn't get so much staining of the water from the clay. And it will settle out with time, and here it's going to overflow. Also, when you go to lower these in, there's a lot of air trapped in that pot. If you just drop it, the air bubbles coming up through the soil will dislodge your gravel and plants. So you always do a slow sink, very slow, or you don't have your tub full of water and you simply add the water next and let it remove the air as it comes up. Okay, I feel kind of foolish because I didn't mean for the pot to be exposed. Probably should have had a shallower pot for this. We're going to pretend this was all level and I got more water and you wouldn't see these edges and rims and things. But depending on whether or not you want a little fish or two, and tiny fish are better. It's just like aquariums. You can't have a giant fish in a tiny body of water. They won't survive. You need little bitty fish. Guppies are also, if you can find guppies in this day and age, I'm sure you can, those are some of the best mosquito eaters there are. They're far more efficient than goldfish at living in small bodies of water, gross stagnant bodies of water, and also those betta fish, those beautiful neon blues and reds and things. Those are puddle muck dwellers in their native environment, so they could live and be happy in this grossness, whereas goldfish and things may not. But guppies in that family are among the best mosquito eaters of the ornamental fish. Just for simplicity's sake, I think I'm too deep over there, but this is eating me alive. I got to show you what it'd look like if it were sunk to a more appropriate depth. But here we go. And slowly, slowly, and you're going to see the water's clear, and you're going to see it's not going to be clear. But I could have gotten around this by using all gravel or more gravel. It's the fact that my mud is so close to the top that we're having this issue. But this is not bad. And actually, that's a little deep, but that's probably closer to a natural depth for this sort of stuff. As I mentioned, well, I don't know where it all went. You're going to get some duckweed and stuff off your plants. These tiny little pieces will become a surface's worth. If you like the look, roll with it. If you want to see a fish, and I should mention, if you're doing fish, more open water is better than having the whole thing with a small amount of water and mostly soil. So in a perfect world, you can adjust. If your water's too deep, I could put a brick under that and get it right where I want it, which would be about, probably in reality, I'd like this to be about there. But you can adjust, you can tweak, you can put rocks and bricks and blocks under things to get them at the proper depth. Real quickly, this is too small a pot. I should have used the big pot for the lily. But just because lilies are kind of what everyone first thinks of when they think water plants, I don't blame you. They're kind of amazing, and I love them. And there's so many different varieties. Look for dwarf ones if you're ordering online. They come with a big, fleshy, tuberous root system like this. This is the storage mechanism. These are the roots. It's okay to trim some of those roots off. And realistically, this should go in a bigger, like that size pot we had before. But let me show you how you pot this. And it's probably better with a lily to have a little soil in it and start, but I can make this work. I'm no stranger to playing in mud. I want this near the surface. But if I leave it near the surface with this amount of mud, it's going to float right back up. So you don't want to bury the whole thing. You see that big bud? That'll probably go ahead and turn into a flower. They're that forgiving unless they've really been mutilated. And being shipped in the mail, you'd probably get fewer leaves. You might not have any leaves, but they rebound quickly. And again, the smaller dwarf varieties may be smaller plants and smaller roots to begin with. It's just, they really are better in the long run. They won't outgrow you so much you have to constantly divide. But once you have some aquatic plants, the rate of multiplication will be so rapid and extensive. If you wanted, you could have little water gardens all over the place in a single summer, or you can share with friends. In fact, something I do occasionally here at the farm as a party idea is just invite people over for a little something stupid. 2 or 3 people, we got tubs like this, everybody bring a bucket. We're gonna make a little water garden, and I'll give them a few plants, and we just do that for an hour or something with a glass of wine, and it's a lot of fun. So, now, you can add fertilizer tablets if you want these things to grow quickly. Because I use natural soil, I know there's some nutrients already in here. I'm not gonna freak out. To fertilize, you scratch the gravel back, you put usually a big tablet, you put that pellet in there, you cover it back up. We're trying to keep the nutrients from being free floating in the water. And if I was going to do a big one like this, now again, you don't have to have lily, you don't have to have extra water. This could all just be no fish and very shallow. Slowly sink this. Now initially the leaves won't all float at the right angle and it'll be kind of jumbled looking. But in just a few days, that'll all straighten out, get to where it needs to be on the water surface, and I suspect this big bud is going to go ahead and emerge. That's not finished looking, but you get the idea. And if this were me for something this size, I'd add 3 little bitty goldfish, and I'd be real happy. In about 2 weeks, that'll be all filled in, looking like it's been there a lifetime. And I would pull up my little lawn chair, and I would sit right here with my cold drink, with my animals and my ducks around, and I'd probably throw some food at them, and I would have the best time ever with my little water feature. I hope you explore some of this. I hope you get into it. It's a whole nother layer of gardening that's a blast, and give it a try. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It's so easy, lots of fun.